Good afternoon and welcome to the Takeup. Today we have episode 206, The Essentials, Line Work and Single Color Design. Good afternoon, folks, and welcome into the Takeup. Glad to have you here for this Friday afternoon for this educational session where we get to talk about something that we all know and love, which is simple line work and machine embroidery. Honestly, it's something that goes into more designs than you would think. It's very easy to think of it as part of things like blackwork or redwork, if you're familiar with the terms, or engraving style designs, the kinds of designs that are like woodcuts that have detailed lines involved in creating value. And by value, we mean how dark a certain area, an isolated area of an image is. The thing is, though that line work is certainly part of doing those kinds of designs, part of doing black work, part of doing red work, part of doing any sort of design that has shading in it. The truth of the matter is that line work is more essential than that and goes into multicolor designs frequently. And frankly, understanding how to do line work well and cleanly is critical to all embroidery design work and digitizing work. Might not be the most exciting topic known to man to some folks, and we're probably not going to go an hour and a half just talking about line work. I do intend to maybe talk a little bit about single color design and what we can control about single color design work as well. But the good part about this is these fundamentals are things that are essential to getting your work to be clean and decent and run well, and to controlling things like the thickness of lines in a design, how our detail looks, how well it sews at small sizes, things like that. These are all related, and it is necessary for us to understand how we can change things to get different values in lines, how we can get thicknesses to be the way we want them to be, and what it means to do clean line work, and kind of how to plan ahead, how to work around and conceptualize what we need to do to put embroidered lines where we want them and to make the settings work for us. So we're going to talk about these things. I'm going to show you some examples of things that I've done before. I've covered some of this before. We've talked about how to make lines and the different sorts of stitches we use to make lines, but I will be taking questions, obviously. If you guys have questions about doing line work, single color work, if you have questions about settings, about software, about how that is executed and what it means to your design, that's all great. We can talk about that. And frankly, I think that some of this stuff, even if we do this as a shorter kind of recap of what it means to do line work, what it means to work on single color elements, this will help you to plan a little bit. And I'll talk about some of those pitfalls we come into, especially when we're talking about making a large connected piece of line work, and how that has to be planned, what we need to think about while we're working, and maybe how we get down to a point where it doesn't feel like we're planning out an entire design. Because one of the things I have encountered is when I show somebody a sufficiently complicated piece of line work, like one that I often show, there's a piece that I've done for Dion's Pizza out here that I show as an example of this. And I'll go ahead and pull this up on screen since I have the ability to do so. Let's go ahead and put that piece up in front of us. This is a pretty complicated little piece of line work. But the thing is, people think when I talk about planning or dealing with things like pathing, which is the path we take, the apparent motion of the needle through the design, or sequencing. When we talk about how we move through a design, people get really confused and upset about the concept of that they're planning this all ahead, and they're going to have to know everywhere they're going to get this planned out, and that there's this massive step of figuring out where I'm headed throughout the design as I'm, before I even touch it. And I'm going to admit to you right now that is absolutely not the case of what I'm usually doing when I digitize something large like this, or I digitize anything that has complicated line work, up to and including smaller things like badges and patches that often have just outlining done on a multicolor design, and those can be pretty detailed as well. You're not really planning an entire design out. It can be tempting to say, yes, this is how we get over the problem of knowing where we're going and knowing what's going to happen and how thick the lines are is by planning. But it's more to the point of instituting a set of rules and guidelines. So as we were little robots following the lines in our design and drawing them, what do we do when we hit a juncture in that line? And when we're looking at the area of a design, how do we plan our way back out of the dead end we put ourselves in as we're drawing? We're drawing these lines and trying to get them to a place when we are trying to get in and out of areas as we draw, and I'll certainly make that more clear as I talk about things in the software. How do we get back out? What are the ways we can conceptualize kind of the direction we travel and how we get that there? And what do we need to control, like I said, to get the look we want, to get the line values we want, to get the thicknesses we want, and to get the overall value in any area of a design, the overall darkness or honestly density, because we're talking about things that, though they aren't a setting on your software, are still a measure of density, how much coverage that we're creating. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Like I said, it's stuff that we might have covered before, but I keep getting questions about, especially people asking me how to do black work and red work and what does that mean. And I think it's all about how we control lines, and then certainly talking about different kinds of stitches, if we're talking about straight or running stitches, if we're talking about satin stitches, if we're talking about motifs, all of this stuff. These things are all kind of couched together in one grouping of how do we do line work and how do we get values, how do we get thicknesses to be what we want them to be. If we can control the most basic versions of that and understand what is controllable about things like the straight stitch in software, we can then do whatever we want to do with that information as we go on further. So let's go ahead and grab some comments. We got folks talking. A lot of you guys are talking to each other. If you are on the replay, by all means, you can skip this because I know you guys sometimes say, oh, why you got to talk to everybody. But when we're live, we join in with the community, and that's what we do here with all of my reciprocators here hanging out in the chat. So chat, we got Frank coming in from the UK saying good evening. Thank you for being here, Frank, and thank you for always sharing this information, getting folks in the door to see us. Scott from Sunrise is here saying happy Friday to everybody. We have everybody talking to each other. I will try not to recap everybody chatting, but we have Joe Rita saying hi. Hi, Joe Rita. Good to see you here. We have Doug joining in from a World Series Los Angeles. Go Dodgers, he says. I don't have a dog in this hunt, but hey, that's good for me. You can have that. Jeff is in here saying hello. Hi, Jeff from Embroidery Nerd. Doing great work over there. Carol says, this will be great information. I think it's some simple information, but it's stuff people have asked me about, and I think just discussing it a bit is worthwhile. We also have everybody talking to each other. Steve's checking in from Iowa. Thank you for joining in, Steve. In any case, we'll go ahead and talk about it. Like I said, this is not everybody's episode. Lots of folks were like, man, why aren't you showing a full project? Why aren't we doing something more complicated? I fully understand that, but this is something that I have multiple questions about. And in the last month, I've had 2 or 3 different people who isolated this one topic and said, can you please help me understand more about it? And I think it's worthwhile to talk about. And frankly, because people think that it is the thing that I just showed you, and honestly, looking at that picture, obviously, if we look at the picture on the left, picture on the right, and I know you guys have seen this sample a million times, but if you think there's anything different about the outlining and shading work that's on the right hand and the single color design that's on the left, you are incorrect. Essentially, aside from some very minor changes in sequence to make it even more efficient on that left side, the piece on the right side is the color blocks underneath the outlining. That is really what's happening there, and there's not much else happening there either. So frankly, it is part and parcel of everything else that we do. It really is. So it's one thing worth checking out for everybody to say, hey, this is often how these things look. It might seem like it's not the same thing, but it really is very similar overall. In any case, having some trouble with StreamYard today. I'm going to tell you guys if something goes in or out, I will let you know, but we've had a little bit of trouble with it. So let me know if you're having any issues. We are looking at a replacement for StreamYard. So once again, sorry for the later start. Sorry for some of the issues we've had technically, but that is what's going on. I'm just going to let you know if you see anything weird, you see any delays, there may be some issues with StreamYard, and hopefully we won't have too much trouble today. Other than that, let's get into it, right? So we are talking about line work. We are talking about things like, once again, often people think of it in the terms of black work and red work, but I want you to understand that all of this is also part and parcel of things like line work in outlining, line work done for shading, done for any other multicolor piece of embroidery. So this is not just for your basic engravings. It is not just for that kind of stuff. By all means, is it part of it? Is it the major thing that we're looking for and what many people are asking about? Yes. And honestly, I'm going to go ahead and show you a couple more items on screen from this. I've got stuff from my own collections. This is the kind of stuff you usually think of. You're thinking of classical blackwork. This is a botanical, a botanical piece that I believe is might be from the 1800s, an engraving piece. We've got some outline work that I did myself for. There's a copy of an Anglo-Saxon brooch, the Pitney brooch, that I did this outlining for. If you see this piece here, this is a single color ostrich feather. It's like a wispy feather with a lot of feather lines in it. The thing that any of these pieces have in common with something much more complicated, like that Dion's piece, is that the outlines are maintained, the thicknesses are controlled, and the direction of travel has to be thought of in order to keep from jumping, trimming, and frankly, from messing with our thicknesses on our lines. Because the thing that we have to remember is when we're talking about doing straight stitch line work, running stitch line work, especially, what controls the thickness of the line is the number of passes over the line. So this is absolutely critical to making sure your line work is even. If you want to get even lines that are exactly the same thickness throughout, the way to handle that is to know how many times you've run over the line with the straight stitches, because as we know, stitches are not going to stand on top of each other. In essence, if a stitch is down and we drop a stitch exactly on top of it, we draw a line exactly on top of that line, those stitches are going to roll off of each other. They are not going to stand right up on top of each other, so they aren't going to appear as a straight line. They're going to roll off. They'll be thicker. They're not going to be a single thickness and just stack higher. Thread just does not do that. So knowing that, understanding that, we can control how thick we want a line to be through how many passes of thread we drop down. And that's really the long and the short of controlling that thickness of the line for straight and running stitches. It is literally about how many passes we put over. And it's not surprising, because many of us know that if you are someone using other types of stitches, if you're using motif stitches, if you're using anything that is not just a straight on running stitch or straight stitch in your software, you already know if you've got a bean stitch, if you've got a back stitch, you know that those are thicker depending on the number of passes that are placed in the line. Because we know a bean stitch, since we're talking about this, a bean stitch classically starts out at 3 passes, and it is a line. We go from point to a point, back to the start point, and then again in a single stitch. Whereas when we are doing this with multiple straight stitch lines, we are usually going across multiple stitches over a line that we're trying to fill in, and then we are going back across that line down the road. Certainly, I want to make it clear that there are other stitch types, like a double stitch type, that can be in your software. I'm going to say that when I'm doing a detailed engraving style piece like this, where I'm doing outline work, I very rarely use a doubled stitch line. And I'll try and explain that in a moment why I don't. Usually I'm going to draw both passes of that line separately. I know it can be incredibly tempting, and it's one of the big pitfalls people run into when they're doing this. You see a line that you've drawn and you don't want to draw it twice. You want it to be two stitch lines thick. You want it to have one pass over, one pass back in order to create that thickness, that uniform double thickness of the line that you're expecting. And so you may want to use a double stitch tool. When you're doing something extremely detailed like this, the problem with that double stitch is it has to path all the way back. And if you use an end point that is anywhere that's not exactly where you started from, there may be a chance for software to run over some branch or go somewhere twice or more than twice that it's not intended to. Or if you are trying to use a double stitched line and you are going, or let's say around a circle, and we stop 3/4 of the way across this thing somewhere, or we put our stop point on the opposite side of the circle and we expect it to be run twice, we have to understand that for the software to get from point A to point B on that circle, if we were looking at our circle, we're at point A and point B. The problem is, if we want to stop at point B, you know that you can't run twice exactly. Why? Because you'll be back at the start point, which means that software is going to either only run once for half that circle, or run 3 times for half that circle to get you where you've told it you want it to stop. That's why the doubled line doesn't take care of all this stuff. It has to be in your head. So you can use things like double stitching. There is software that does that. A Stitch Artist has it, for instance. But if you use a tool that automates that doubled line, understand that when you stop anywhere else from where, except for where you started on that line, there is a chance for that, or it will path that in some way that either puts extra stitches on a segment of that shape or less passes. So either extra passes or fewer passes on that shape to get to the final point, to get to the end point of that shape. So I know it's something that I will probably show you in software in a minute here, but it is something to understand that because thickness is determined by passes, right? If we know that that's how we're going to get it, the thickness of the line, the boldness of the line, the weight of the line, if you want to call it that, and that's really the more technical term here for most folks when you're coming from a design standpoint for this, the weight of that line, the thickness of that line, it is established by how many passes are over there. So if we don't control carefully how many passes go over that line, we are going to see a variation in thickness. And when we use automated tools like double stitch versus a single straight stitch that we control running over twice, we may end up with more or less, like extra or too few passes over one segment of the shape. This is not a fault in the software. This is a user error thing. The software can only do what is possible to do. It is going to keep the needle down and stitch from the start point to the end point we supply for it. It is going to attempt to double that line wherever it can. But if it encounters that kind of situation, we all know if you go out somewhere and then return one time, any shape, any line, you know that if you go out and you have a second pass, it has to come back to where it started. There is no way for us to end somewhere else and completely cover that same line with two passes. Also, we know that if we want to advance forward, and this is also something we learned in doing motifs, you want to advance from point A to point B again. We know that if we want to do that, just like a bean stitch, we need an odd number of passes to end up on the other side, but that also affects our thickness of the line. So I know that seems like, wow, we're really talking about something very basic, that when we're talking about straight stitches, that passes are the thing. But I think it's worthwhile to understand that and to kind of bring that to the forefront and say, hey, this is how it's going to happen. There's no other way to have this happen aside from stopping, trimming, and jumping. And we also know that whenever you stop and trim a line, a straight stitch or a manual stitch, whatever you're doing to make your line, especially with a straight or running stitch, we're going to have a small knot that's related to tying off and tying in so that we don't unravel something. And often, even if we just do a couple of back stitches, that small knot, that small extra area of thickness, because it actually essentially puts a very small area of more passes on the end of your stitch line, will look thick or knotted, and we don't really want that. Most of the time when we're trying to do something that is in the realm of black work or outline work or most line work, we're trying to have an even stitch thickness, and we don't want little blobs and knots at the end of our lines. So we're trying to keep a single course of thread, a single piece of thread without jumps and trims wherever humanly possible. And you'll find in a lot of the designs that I'm showing today, we have lots of these engraving style designs. This Kinesio design is a very small left chest design. We have this piece for Al Unser, which is a large jacket back design. And this one actually has a mixture of going back and forth between doubled run stitch and satin stitches, which once again, satin stitches have to travel in a certain way. They only travel forward. So if we're trying to return back to a start point, we have to realize that if there's a satin stitch in that path, then we want to travel to the end of the satin stitch area before we stitch satin stitch and then run the satin back toward us. That is because if we have to connect back up and finish our line, and I'll show you that possibly in software in a second, we need to think that how are we going to get back if we have to have a section of this satin stitch that we're going to add into our line work. Like I said, if you guys are listening to this on podcast, I apologize. This is very likely going to be a very visual episode. Lots of these are, but this one in particular. When we are trying to think about where we're headed and how we get back to our start point and maintaining that thickness over the line, we do have to understand that the travel of stitches only works in a certain direction. Satin stitches are going to travel forward, where our start point and our end point, they're going to end away from where we started generally. And if not, you can use your start and end points to do this. You will be tracking with a travel stitch to the end and then stitching back to where you started from. It can be done automatically, obviously, in software, the start and end points, but it's something that we should think about as we are going through this process, that yes, we can go out and back toward ourselves, but as we do this, we're going to know that there is going to be travel stitching underneath it, and we need to understand anything past that point. Let's say we are stitching up toward a satin stitched area that is filling in. We are going to go past it and then have to come back. That we don't want to do start and stop points on that satin or insert it before the line that is past where we're heading. Now, I think, like I said, this is stuff that I'm going to have to show you visually. I'm going to bring up software and show you some examples, but I'm also going to very likely draw some new examples live for you and kind of explain what's going on. Suffice it to say, this is something where you have to get into this mindset of understanding, where am I going, where have I come from, and how do I want to get back to where I started? And a lot of that really is about just having that thought in mind ahead of time of, what is it that I'm trying to achieve? Where am I, where am I going to end up in the end? And how am I kind of tracking for myself where these things are headed, where they're going, and what do I want from that thickness? Because you can selectively, that's the other thing. You'll see a lot of my designs where all of the stuff that I'm doing is essentially going to be done with that kind of thought that, I want exactly 2 lines of stitching everywhere because all the lines are very even. There's a lot of blackwork and redwork where there's not a ton of change in the thickness of the line itself, but there are multiple lines placed closer or further apart in order to create that kind of value. That is something that's going to happen in a lot of engraving style work. And then the lines themselves may not be different thicknesses, but if you choose to have 3 passes over a certain area to make that area have thicker lines, you absolutely can. You can have thicker and thinner lines in the same piece, but it does make you do the mental gymnastics of saying, all right, if I do a 3-pass line here, now I'm on the opposite side of that line, and how am I going to get back to any other lines that are only have 1 pass right now in the cycle of getting in from, say, the edge of the design or from the place where I started? Let's say I have to go back and cover those lines one more time that I came from. How am I getting back to those? Like I said, this can be pretty complicated to talk about. It's not the easiest thing to do on a podcast style show. Certainly, I'm going to show you some stuff visually that will hopefully kind of get you there. But suffice it to say, it is worthwhile to understand that this kind of mental gymnastics does happen as you're working through this stuff. And worthwhile to know that it's not something you necessarily have to plan out, but something that you will eventually kind of get a handle on as you work. So like I said, we'll go ahead and look at this piece one more time. We're looking at this owl uncer, this Cuba Vera piece, and we can see when I talk about things like coming in from the edge or passes, you can imagine that many times you have a starting point that you are coming from. You decide to work, let's say, from the edge, the border of this piece. I'm just kind of highlighting this with my cursor. If we imagine that I am at the edge of the border of this car, this piece here, up toward this windscreen, and I decide that, okay, I am walking around this edge, and as I'm digitizing, I need to travel into the design to start knocking out these lines. As I travel in, you'll see, okay, I've gone over 1 pass as I digitize in, and maybe I see another line that I have to attach it to. And let's see, I'll zoom in on this so you can see a little closer. Then I'm going to stop here and continue my line further in. Then I find another place that I'm going to deviate. There's some shading here in the driver. Well, I start drawing my lines to back down into the piece. Then when I get to a point where I feel like I want to start heading back where I was going to originally to make 2 passes, I will start drawing my lines back out of this section. And then I'm back up to where I started on this branch. That is a tour. That's what I like to call these, a tour into the design. And then I start backing back out to the previous line I was at. And then I can move forward again into a deeper part of the design. And this is kind of the way that we start to think of these things. We start to go through these things and say, as I'm traveling, I have a start point that I've started from. As I travel into the design, when I encounter another line touching where I am currently coming from, when I encounter a junction point, a fork in the road where 2 lines deviate, I'm going to then travel from that line and decide whenever I hit each one of these forks in the road where I'm going to head next. And just remember as I come back that I need to cover that line again and complete that circuit, complete the tour. So we're trying to control the number of passes over each line. And as we go through this thing, I like to think of any sort of black work or red work or outlining in tours. I move out from a point. Once I get to an extreme, a point that I can no longer go any further, or where I feel like I want to head back, either because I'm concerned about issues with pathing, maybe I'm concerned about maybe trying to fill in an area and not work into a place that I'm eventually going to hit later, I will then path back out of it. I will then retrace my steps. So we think about it like we are walking through a design as if we are a little line following robot, following the line in the art. We walk our way to the junction point, to the fork in the road. We decide which way we're taking the fork. We keep on walking until we end up at the next fork. We do this over and over again until we hit the point where we want to start heading back to our original spot. And then we retrace our steps. And yes, I do mean that we're drawing lines twice for this. We're not just using double stitch lines. We can use double stitch lines for certain things, but I do have some methods to my madness for why I don't do that. Number one, because like I said earlier, if we encounter something like you're seeing in this piece where I might be working towards something where there's a satin stitch, I can't really just stop in the middle of my double stitch line and drop a satin stitch, whereas I can stop on the halfway point where I've drawn my first straight stitch line at signal thickness out to it. Then I can work back across there, covering each one of my satin stitches. Now, let me pull up the actual design and let's try and run through it. I'll tell you this too. Also, not all designs are counted out perfectly, and sometimes you make one line a little too thick, and depending on the size of the design and the amount of detail in the area, it might be okay. And I'm not going to say each of my designs is entirely perfectly done. I will say that I certainly attempt to control these things. But we're going to go ahead and pull up the design. First, I'll kind of show you the entire design just so you can see it. This is what the entire design looks like. And in fact, I'll give you a couple of other views. Let's go back into this piece. You can see the entire design as a single color piece. I will show you briefly. I've got a scan. It's not the best scan. Let me try and grab that. This is unfortunately the only picture I currently have of the larger color design. This is from a reject, unfortunately. But this is what the color version looked like before they decided to do the fully single color version of it. What you can see that is very different is that instead of just being a background fill area behind this, we do have this kind of lightly graded, though it is not made to be a full gradation in the unser. And that's once again using just essentially accordion fills or accordion spacing, gradient spacing in this fill area. And you'll see that the background in this owl for owl unser is actually fully cut out and done differently, expanded and a little bit larger to leave open space in the single color version. So you've seen the full color version. We'll go back up to the single color version and you will see that we actually have this doubled outline with a gap instead of a single outline, and it is expanded to leave open space inside of the lettering for owl there. So there are certainly differences between the two, but the actual work that's here for kind of red work, black work, engraving work has not changed whatsoever, even though in the driver we did have color in the actual piece. But one of the things I kind of wanted to show you and talk about is how we deal with things in, let's say, this tire where we have kind of this darker area, this shaded area, or over here on the tire on the left-hand side where we are going to transition into a satin stitch and back out. So what I'd like to do is kind of replay some of the design, and we'll get to that replay area. And as we get to that replay area, we can kind of discuss, how that looks and what it means to kind of work on that pathing in that area to try and figure out where you're headed and how you're going to head back. So I think what we'll do is actually go to that left-hand tire and look at how that was built. So here's what I'm going to show you guys. Let's see here. If I can pull that up, I'm having a little bit of delay on StreamYard again, so I'll see if I can pull that up in a way that is useful to us. In this case, we'll see kind of how we travel back around this thing, and I'll show you real quick. We'll get a single line here. I've got it pulled up. Sorry, we're having some delays on StreamYard. I can see that it's kind of going funny, and I don't want to tax it to the point where we get cut up or have a problem with delays or I start sounding like a robot. Here we are. Here is our tire, and I'll go ahead and get myself kind of out of the way a little bit so you can see what I'm talking about. But we run through the rest of this design, and as we can see running through the design here, it looks like we missed that. Let me go ahead and get it back to where we were. As we go through all the detail in the design, we get back up to where we're starting to draw these lines in the tire. And what I wanted to show you is as we draw these, you can see we're going back across these pieces, and then we are jumping through. We've got a thicker line here intentionally that we're covering. And then here's how we're going that double line. You'll see that I'm starting to travel down that line. So this is just single straight stitch. And then you'll see I am now traveling past the area where I have that darkened area, that stripe that is done in satin stitch to show that darker area of the tire. And I travel past it. I start traveling back up my line. We go through there, and this is one entire doubled line. Now that we have that other area that has the stripe, you'll see that I deviate. So my line is going toward the center of that satin since I'm traveling past it. Going back up, and you can see there's the underlay that gives you the shape of that satin. And then we travel back up with the satin, right? So we have a satin stitch that's traveling back up from the bottom. The satin stitch only travels in that one direction from where we start to where we end. So we know that I need to go past it and come back so that I can now double up that line again. And this one has some extra little shading details that are in here as well. This one, unfortunately, this version, I think I accidentally had more underlay turned on in this piece. That is not how the final piece went. You can see that I'm now covering that straight stitch line again. And then where we had that little area that I deviated, that's where that next satin stitch is. Yeah, once again, this was an early version. This does not have the final underlay on it. Much less underlay in the final version of this one. I must have grabbed the wrong guy. But suffice it to say, we can see that we have a satin stitch that now is coming back up and covering in that area. So you can see what I'm talking about as far as these tours. I'm coming in from the edge of the tire. I am traveling down with one thickness of straight stitch. Here you see me deviating, and that's me hiding the line under the satin stitch that I'm eventually going to have. Then I go back through here. Because that satin stitch lines up with the edge of this piece, I don't want this line to just continue on through. I need to tuck it into the middle of the satin stitch so it doesn't try and pop out. You can see how the edge of this satin stitch lines up with the line. It's not dead center, so it's not something that I can just hide by going through the piece. We travel back up after we go. Here's the first dark section. You can also see the satin stitch, despite the extra underlay here, is overlapped with the other satin. We have a nice crisp line here, and it does not pull apart down here where it should have full coverage. Then after that gets done, we go through our last little piece of this shading. And then we get past that little deviation. You saw that I covered that line a second time. Now it's exactly 2 passes thick. And then we keep on tracking along. And you can hear me clicking madly because I'm doing this. I'm advancing it one stitch at a time so we can kind of watch it and be really mindful about how that goes. And there we go. It is just covering that up. And then, as you can see, as it travels back up, we now have 2 passes on that line. And that's going to continue that way throughout the tire. Down to the bottom, back up to the top, and everything in that nature goes the same way. In this case, we do see a jump to that 2. It is entirely isolated, so I decided to put it last in the sequence because I wanted to trim before I went back to it. But the same kind of thing is happening throughout the design. You know what I'm saying? It is essentially a process of going through the piece and traveling along the area. The thing is, I'm not planning every single thing before I go. What I'm doing is I'm planning a good start point. I'm thinking about what sits on top of what. Why is the ground running first in this segment? Ground's running first because later on when I start putting in the shadow on the ground that's solid and I throw the tires in here, I can cover all my travel stitches and then the tires look like they're closer to me than the stitches that are in the ground, in the texture that makes up the dirt. Of course, that's going to run before those stitches run. That is just normal to imagine. So we look at the rest of these pieces and similar stuff's going on. We can see that we do have more tread on these back tires. So they have these individual lines that are going through, but the same kind of process is being done throughout. We are traveling over the lines, deciding where we're going to come back. And when we come back, we are very mindful of how we're traveling to cover those lines twice. So it is just about controlling the direction of travel, controlling the path, and understanding where we want that thickness to be. So throughout the piece, that same process is happening. Travel out, return back. And when we actually look at this piece over the course of the entire thing, you'll see that the final outline does tend to return on a lot of these. In the case of this one, we have so much satin on the outside edge. We have sections that are separated from each other, but others you're going to see that the satins are entirely, or the edges are entirely connected. And I mean, this really holds true. I'm going to show you a lot of car stuff. It's just in some of the stuff I was looking at while we're looking through this. Lots of these pieces are very similar, though you'll see many of them, you don't have as much variation in line weight. And in that case, you really are talking about just traveling twice across the piece. You know, it really is about making sure you just hit that travel. But the directions of things, the way that they're planned is the same way we would do for carved stitching, is the same way we would do for any other kind of sequencing. Things that are closer to us are on top so that we can overlap them and make them make sense. So when we have solid areas, like we have these shadows under the car, and then eventually we're going to have tires that run on top of them, you can see that I've got these satin stitch tires. So I've got some texture that separates it from the shadow. Those are certainly going to run after the shadow that's supposed to kind of show the shadow on the ground of these cars. And why is that? Because I want the tire to pop to the front and have its own texture, even though it's all in a single color. So that's where we're also talking about single color design work. But we can see that as we travel through this piece, once again, we are really mindful about our directions we're traveling, and we return back to where we started. So yes, we start in one place and then come back, but we always go back of those lines, and you'll see me coming back after the fact, back over the lines that need to be drawn twice. Now, some of these in the grill, done a single time because I don't want extra coverage, but sometimes you do. You want extra coverage, extra thickness, and where you do, you make sure to do those doubled passes. It's worth thinking about. Other piece I've shown many times, the orchards, this redwork piece, and I'll show you the actual stitch out on that again later. You can see that this is the same way. We stay in that center point. We start there. We're traveling throughout. You can see that there are occasional jaunts over to do straight stitch or to do satin stitch work. But as we travel through the piece, you'll see that things are done twice. Here's a tour all through that branch, and then it comes back to the original piece of the branch. You see this? This is where I'm going to go zoom in a little bit. Even though this looks choppy at a larger size, we're going to zoom further into it. And let's go into this little section of branch that I'm outlining here so you can see what I'm talking about with these tours. So as we get to this piece, so we're up to the top of this sign, and you can see I'm starting to travel out from the sign. That's me going out for one branch, coming back to the center, out for the branch, coming back to the center, out, back to the center. And it keeps happening. And you'll see as I go through this kind of dendrite pattern, this tree pattern, literally, of branches, that I'm going to return back to the line that I started from. And here's the thing, without looking at this ahead of time, I can trust that this was going to happen for me to get that solid thickness of line work throughout. So we're just going to go ahead and track this down. We'll watch it come back, and eventually you'll see that this line right there goes back to the original start point right here. So this little area is one tour of that line work. And like I said, this is not maybe the most interesting for everybody, but the thing is, whenever I show somebody a decently detailed piece of line work, whenever I show somebody something that tends to have something, I mean, you look at something like this, we have this really simple knotwork, that's pretty intelligible. You don't think much of it. When you look at something like the Orchards piece, when you look at something like the Dion's piece, the Cubavera from Unser that we did, these were done on the back of Cubavera shirts. These pieces tend to be a little stymieing for early digitizers. They don't feel like they know where to start. The truth of the matter is, though I do have things I decide on where to start, the reason the Orchards piece starts the way it does in the center of this design is I'm actually trying to roughly center it out for caps. That is the way this design runs. It actually runs in a way that centers out and runs from the bottom up as much as possible in order to make this thing run better on caps that have a little bit of looseness to them, that don't always work in the hoop the way you want them to into the frame. And so in this case, that was sequenced in that way, but we still think of it in a very similar way as any other piece of black work or design work that has lines in it, that we have to cover things twice and kind of make that pathing make sense. So like I said, it really depends on what you're working on, but the concept is still there. When we're working on running stitch or straight stitch line work, the real concept is just understanding the number of passes per line that we want. Many of my work is just double pass work and doesn't have much else going on with it. I'll show you some more of that in a second. But it is very similar to when we're looking at bean stitches, or even when we're looking at multi-pass satin stitches, understanding that the individual thickness of the stitch is very similar to the individual line. The number of passes over is very much like the number of counts in a bean stitch or even in a multi-pass satin stitch, that each stitch will look thicker based on literally the number of passes over that single stitch as far as those are going, or we have count in as far as those, but then we have passes the other way. And really the pathing is more about understanding where you came from and getting back there. My favorite way to handle that is to think in tours, where when we encounter a fork in the road, we return to that place. So let's go ahead and just look at some other pieces. This is another one that I've done previously, the American Academy of Pediatrics that I've shown you in a 75 weight thread. So that's why there's not a lot of detail here. You'll see that I'm reducing the amount of detail because I'm going to be working very, very small. But when we look at a piece like this, the same kind of stuff holds up. The one thing that's a little different is that we do have fill stitches being used for some of this dark area in here. And you'll see that that's done after. Generally, the detail work is done first, and then the fill stitches are run after so that it can kind of blend in nicely and that we don't have any traveling along the edge of that fill. You can see that there are no travel stitches sitting on top of that fill. This initial stuff is done before the fill stitch done is after it. So when you have a jagged edge on a fill, this is another kind of interesting thing for line work. If we are going to use fills for shadowing, that you want to run all of that jagged work, that manual work, before you put in any fills or satins on top of it, though you can, as you can see, embed them in your work. So let's go ahead and just watch this thing run through, and we'll start to see what we're doing. And we can also see I'm starting here down at the bottom, but we're still working in tours, right? We go up to the area we're trying to go. We go back to our starting point, up into the area, back to our starting point. And we just do this over and over, up into the design very deeply. And then what we're going to see is eventually right there, I'm starting to return and I'm back down to the foot at this point. And then I'm starting in on the other side. So I had this entire area where I started down here by this right foot. I go all the way through this, working on all these elements, all connected, a single filament of thread. And as you see also that I go out to the end of a branch and then I work back, covering in my satin stitch areas on the way back on the second half of the tour. Then I go back, start working another tour. And this is just how we progress through the entire design. And as you can see, some things don't even have to make a tremendous amount of sense. I could have, when I got to the end of this arm here, I could have decided to keep outlining the arm and finishing the child. In this case, I did not. Could I have finished the interior of this design and worked on the arm, the other half of the face? I could have largely. I did some of the face work later so I could kind of blend the shading in a certain way, but you're going to still see I definitely could have done that. I decided against it. Did I do all of my pathing ahead of time and have an exact map of the entire way the design worked before I started digitizing? Absolutely not. I digitized on the fly, and the design is no worse for wear. As long as we don't travel a great distance on a large palette, let's say we're working on a jacket bag, you want to be more isolated in each area so that if we go over a line and then come back to it much later after we've done a ton of stitching, that we haven't shifted the material so much that the two lines don't line up or they don't look like we are on the same line. We actually end up with two thin lines next to each other that are separated by all that distortion in the material instead of having the same line doubled over in thickness. But we can see same thing's happening. I go out and do this tour in the edge, and then I start returning. But in this case, because I'm doing that fill stitch detail on the outside edge that covers, I'm doing that fill stitch second. So I did all of my tours. You'll see that each one of these lines, and I'll go ahead and slow it down so you can see it, is being doubled as I go, but there's only a single line of travel going up toward the next line. Why is that? Because I'm eventually going to come back and cover all of that with this fill stitch. And then we do our doubled outline for this area, and that's just the underlay for our satin. And then we're back onto doing very standard work that has trims and all that once we're in all satins and once we're working through just the lettering. However, that concept of tours, the concept of traveling out and returning to where you started, is still in play. I started from the bottom of that line and my fill returns back to the bottom of that area. So when we think about doing red work, black work, and we're trying to get those even lines, one of the ways we can handle that very well is just continuing to think about tours. We have a point we started from. We go out to the point where it connects somewhere else where we don't want to go into the finish of the design. So whenever we hit that point, and that can be at any time, it can be for multiple reasons. Like I said, staying in a one clustered area, especially on a large jacket area, you may want to work in quadrants so that we don't spread things apart or don't have registration area errors as we move the fabric around, which is inevitable with embroidery. So we want to stay in an area, then we might not travel a ton into a design and then come back. Whereas if we're working on a small design, we can tour out as pretty much as far as we want on a left chest and then come back, and we're not likely to have shifted the material that much. But think in those tours. Very simple piece here, and I'll start to show you some images of these in a second so you actually get more of an idea. This is a strap of knotwork that was actually from a Viking Age picture stone from Sweden. It's the Stora Hammar stone, and I'm probably saying that incorrectly, but the Stora Hammar stone has this border around some segments in it. And I did this piece and gave this to a good friend of mine for a project, but it's just a simple piece of knotwork. This is just doubled lines. So let's just run through it. And this is without previewing it. I kind of know exactly what's going to happen with it because it's just how things work. We've selected a start point right here toward the top of the design. But as we see, we tour in through the knot and we get to this point here. This is where I've stopped the tour. How can I tell? Because now I'm going to start doubling those lines. We go back across. Then we tour on. So it's like each of these lines gets doubled through the point. So that, and a lot of these you see that is doubled in already. So we're not traveling back over it. Doubled already, doubled, and then back out. See, this is the tour ending and then traveling back out to the point where we started, which is in here. Well, actually, we still haven't gotten to the final outline, but this point where we deviated from the fork in the road, and then back out, and then back to the edge. And we haven't gone all the way back up to the top here, but that's because at the end of this cluster of knots, I'm going to outline the entire thing one last time. So all of those repeats happen. And then once we get to the very end of that, we start doing the final edge and the outside edge on the right-hand side. And we see all those tours start to connect. We do our top repeat of the knot. And as we do that, we connect back up and then all the way back around the design until we reach our original start point, meaning that each one of these lines is exactly 2 passes thick. And the outside edge is now connected, and we've ended at exactly the place we started. Why did I start at this little junction point here that you see where we are between the 2 knots and we have this little divot? I often start in places that have a nice natural junction like that, because then you will see that some of those stitches to tie in aren't as visible if you have an area that's kind of already a little dark, that's thicker, where we have a junction point between 2 lines. We can kind of play with that. And sometimes I will manually tie in and use fewer stitches. If I have a couple of short stitches, I'm often happy enough to say I'm not likely to have that come apart if I go back to that same point where I'm tying off at the end. Most of the time, that's going to be fine. We do a slow start if we're really worried about that on a long run. But the truth of the matter is, usually you're fine. And an area that already has a little dark crevice, a corner, an overlap like that makes a nice place to hide that knot in any case. So like I said, this is something that's fairly simple, but it's worth kind of going over. Other things to notice, I'm going to talk about this a little tiny bit more before we finish up with kind of this concept of these tours, is that sometimes you'll have areas that look thicker. And in fact, let me bring this off screen for a minute. We'll show you some images because we do have pictures of a lot of these to look at. First and foremost, I also want to say thank you very much to Carolyn Cagle of Stricka Knits, because I'm going to show a couple of her pieces where she did that knotwork element, and I'll just kind of show you how those look. She did those larger on a very natural kind of linen fabric here, I believe, and this was done as kind of a tip of the hat to Viking Age design. So she's got some lovely matte finish stuff here. So that's those knotwork panels done larger on a dress. And I think those are kind of nice. So here's another close-up of those panels. And you'll see that you can kind of see where that knot is in that piece, but it's not super, super visible. But you can also see that we have a nice double thickness on each of those lines, and that it is fairly obvious that the thickness is even throughout. So we don't have any kind of crazy, especially odd-looking pieces, even on this fairly coarse fabric that might want to make things track a little bit strangely. We don't see a lot of that. So that's nice. It does turn out pretty well. The other one I've showed you, this is the Orchards piece. Once again, this was run in 40 weight matte finish thread from Madeira, if you want to know. Though there's other folks who have stuff like this, but this is a polyester matte finish. This one runs a little thin, so it looks nice and open. It is kind of like running a thinner weight thread, lighter, kind of thinner thread. But that's how that one looks. We have the unser that we looked at before. I'm not going to go over every single piece we have here, but one of the other ones I'm showing you really quickly is this. This is the Pitney brooch, the Anglo-Saxon brooch piece. And one thing I want you to notice is that we do have a kind of a thicker look to these lines that are on the spine of these animals. It's kind of zoomorphic. You see the eye of this one serpent here, and then we see another serpent here. The thinner serpent is grabbing kind of at the neck of this serpent. This serpent is biting its own body as we have this interlaced. It's not really a serpent, but it looks like a serpent head. But we'll see actually this is a foot and leg off of this zoomorphic beast. So zoomorphic meaning animal shaped. But we also have these kind of very much kind of plant-like tendrils that are here too. So this kind of design work can be complicated. The thing is that the spine on this beast, on this body, we have this thicker look. But what we're seeing is not that I've gotten multiple passes here, but when we have two sets of lines that are very close to aligning, these circles were done twice in their line. They were not separated. Or they are separated. They were not as part of this line. So we have areas where the circles line up with that spine. And so we get a thicker, darker look to a lot of that where those line up. But at the same time, you can see how that kind of closeness of line makes for a darker area all through the spine of that beast on that piece, even though that's all really single line areas. Whereas when we look at darkness in something like this dogwood flower, it's all about how close together these individual lines of stitching. And that's really a concept of kind of detail density. Even though this is not a fill stitch or marked in density, the closeness of those lines to each other determines how dark that area is going to be. Same thing with a lot of these other designs, but still, it's something I wanted to show you here is that we do kind of have that darkness in that spine that is specific to those lines being closely aligned to each other. The closer the lines are together, and if we draw two elements, even though they are separated, if there is not enough clear airspace between them, the eye is going to see that as a thicker, bolder line, even if we haven't passed over each of these elements any extra times. So closeness of lines to each other also works on that, right? It also causes that to look thicker, look denser, look darker. Like I said, another thing that's about planning for your design may not be as much critical to you, but it does make a difference to that look. And sometimes people will say, oh, my design doesn't look like it's the right density in this area. And it really is more about how close lines are together. And because, like I said, these pieces, and I'll zoom into them, a couple of things to notice too is that despite the fact that looks very round on the pieces, these are done with very straight stitches. What makes these look more round? This slight jitter to the lines. I'm going to show you this in more detail. The fact that all of these corners don't exactly match up, and I have these offsets. There's a really good example of it over here. I have an offset right here. You see how these 2 points are offset slightly, and that all of these corners are offset slightly. When you offset those corners slightly, that kind of buckling of the line being offset can make it look more round. In fact, let's go back to the image and show you. Those look pretty round. They don't look like big hexagons all over the place. But though we have a fairly round aspect to those little circles that are on that spine, when we look at them closely, some of them really play off as just hexagons, straight up hexagons. But the offsetting of those corners by drawing it twice instead of using a single line and telling that line that I want it to stitch twice means that I can offset my penetration points on my stitches, and I can use that to change the roundness of a line. And I'm going to show you that in more detail in a second, because I think it's something worthwhile on these lines. But let's go ahead and go through the tours on this one too. Just kind of look at how it's put together. Might not be perfect, but that's the thing. I just want to show you. We've started here kind of toward the middle. You'll see again, it's right here. Our starting point is right near the face, the face of the second beast with the two eyes kind of staring toward us, rather than this one with the large almond-shaped eye that's looking over here to the right. And we'll go ahead and watch our tours. We'll see that these ones are each done twice as they attach to that back line. So the little circles are done twice individually. Then we're going to tour out, and we'll see each tour as we go. We're kind of branching off, keep on branching out. And each one of these kind of separate tours off of a fork, we'll see there's one tour there, and then it comes back from there, and there that just joined back up to where it started. That whole section off of that kind of foliated leaf type shape comes back to that origin from that branch. And we keep coming back around. You'll see these individual tours form up. And as we go through, we start filling in each of the areas of the design. I didn't necessarily plan every direction I was going to travel, but as I get back around and everything starts to double up, you're going to see me return back to the point of origin, and we're done. We get all the way back to that point of origin, and every line only gets done twice. So that is just one of those things. It's just kind of about as we go to each fork in the road, thinking about how we're going to get back to where we started. And I know that honestly, as much as I can talk about this and show it to you, one of the best ways for you to handle this is to go find a piece of line work you want to work on and try it for yourself. It is with practice and repetition that this gets to be really kind of seamless. It becomes very meditative, and you can run those lines out and run them back to that original point. But you can see how that ran. I'll go ahead and go through it one last time for you to watch that thing form up. We start from that central point, we tour out toward the edges, fill in those areas, and then come back. What I'm going to say about this piece is if I were doing this in the ideal way again and starting over, I wouldn't leave this small section to be filled in last. To me, that's a little bit of a mistake because you could see bubbling in that area. It is possible on loose enough material. You might see just a little bit of raised material here. It's not a very large area. These squares are 10 mils. That's 1 centimeter inside that square. Not a huge area, not likely to bubble up much. But if I were trying to do this again and making it ideal, I would probably take this little section that I didn't fill and start over, or at least go to the beginning of this design. We talked about editing designs that are already in place, and I would think about filling this little area before I went in with the rest of the design. So honestly, can you see that it's not always perfect? Surely. But the one thing that is perfect is any line is only going to have 2 passes over it because I wanted this to have a very uniform thickness to the line. So same kind of thing, same kind of work. We're going to go ahead and show a couple more that I actually have. Here is this woodcut cornucopia. As you can see, it's a pretty small design. It's done for a little napkin corner. You can get this on the Embrilliance website if you want it. Coming up to Thanksgiving, we have this guy is here, and I believe I also may have my woodcut turkey somewhere in here because it's another very simple design of that same completely universal 1 line of thread, 2 passes over each line kind of design. We're going to go ahead and zip through this one as well. Let's actually make that just a little larger. I'll zoom it down just a little bit so you can see the entire thing instead of it being under my picture here. But let's go ahead and zip through that. You can see I've started down at the bottom, right at that junction. You see, again, I've chosen a point where 2 lines meet. It's a nice, clean point. It's easy to reference, and it hides that knot pretty well to be down at the bottom. So we have this original tour, and I'll go ahead and slow that down just so we can see that one again. Once I veer off, I get to this point and I start to return back, and we'll see that I'm now traveling forward again. So those little tours are happening, these little sub tours. That's another lovely one right there, into the leaf and back out. So the central veins in this leaf go through the veins and then back to where I started. Each little sub joint, sub tour, we go down to the end of that twig and we head on back to where we started. And as you can see, this continues throughout the design. We go back, and we actually went back. This completed it right back to that point where we started, actually. And then we're back in from the edge. And we can see we're working in through that kind of rope-like border of the cornucopia and back out into the texture, through the leaves, through the acorns. And this is a wonderful way to see that line again. Each one of these lines, as we get to the top, we go back down to the travel line that is our origin. So here we go up from there. We tour up. We decide we're going to go back. In that case, I decided to fill in that inner edge of that line on that tour. It's not set in stone. We can work on it as we go. We can decide when we're going to fill in lines. We just have to be very mindful of when we start and where we end. And you can see that I then came around to finish the edge of that cornucopia further on down the line. But out to the edge of the tours and then back around. In this case, you'll see this because I'm doing the edge. You'll often see that if I have a final border on this one, instead of turning back around where I had just started from, in order to make the final border around the edge of an outline very continuous looking, rather than turning back around here and potentially introducing a little split where I start and stop, I will, on the very last run of a design where I'm going to outline the outer edge, I'll keep on going forward and just complete the circuit all the way around for the doubled stitch. So you'll often see that on a design that I do, the last outline, if it is an outline that goes around the edge of the piece that I'm touring through, I will go ahead and just zip around it one more time to finish out all the lines. If I don't have any doubled lines on the outside edge when I get to it, that's what I'll do. So like I said, it is something where it's worth understanding that it's something that you do use similarly to, because I wanted to show you other stuff like it. It is something that we do in outlining for any design. I notice it a lot in very simple like badge designs are one of the ones that I've seen several times, where the outline is essentially a single color design that's placed on top of something that is carved. In fact, I'll show you something like that briefly. But you'll think about all this kind of blackwork stuff like this. And this is a very simple, really old design of mine that I did for New Mexico Department of Corrections. So here's a badge. You're like, how the heck does this work out to be like blackwork? Well, because honestly, if we look at this design, it really is two components. In this case, being me and doing things the way I do, yeah, that looks like a big yellow slab, but if you get a little closer, that's not a big gold slab. It's a ton of work that's done sculpturally in order to make this thing look more like an actual badge. And that's one of the single color things I wanted to talk about before I got finished here. We can see that though, here's my global underlay for the entire badge. Then I've worked on some background fill elements that are very flat. These cover most of just the background areas between the other elements that I'm going to work on later. Now I have these lovely satin stitch carved leaves for this kind of laurel wreath around the outside edge. And then you'll see the rays that are inside of it are light density satins on top of the fill. So we have these kind of solar rays that are kind of inside coming out from the central seal. And then we have lovely carved feathers for the eagle at the top. And you'll see that that'll complete on the other side once I get done. We have all of these raised elements for these banners done in a nice flat fill so I can put my lettering on them later. And we have these lovely carved wings and the head of the eagle. But as you can see, all of that is done in essentially a single color. And this is what you would do if you were trying to carve a single color silhouette into something that has a little more definition. And then we watch our outline run. We start here at the bottom. And what you're going to notice is the outlining on this piece is done in tours. It's just like working on blackwork. It's very similar because I want a very uniform line width. And it is entirely connected. And when we are finished with it, aside from the final text, which actually I did differently because we did some color change in the text and the text had to be changed frequently, because sometimes you'll find a badge like this is used for more than one department. I usually run the satin stitch text separately. And in this case, I did do that for this. Now, this is hand digitized, but I did leave it separately so that it could have color changes or be replaced. And as you can see, we also have area in the banner here for other text. But here's your first very simple version of like a multicolor design that's essentially got a piece of straight stitch blackwork on it as the rest of that design definition. Outlining is essentially the same as blackwork. It's easy to think of it differently and think of these designs, these single color designs, especially the stuff like those florals, those things that are very decorative, as something separate. But this is something you're going to do all the time, right? It is really the same kind of work. Now, in this case, this doesn't have a lot of shading. Scott says, great timing. I'm working on a hat logo. They want to create shading using Linework. I'll show you maybe a little bit more of that really quickly to talk about that. And Carol says, and this is a very, very nice. Thanks, Carol. Thank you for being the tour guide. Yeah, I think that these tours, thinking in tours is important. But yeah, the concept of using shading using Linework, it really is like drawing with a ballpoint pen. We know the line is always going to be the same thickness. The thickness of the line is really the thread. Now, certainly we are doubling that line or tripling that line to get a thicker line, but ultimately the thickness of thread is what we know we're working with. You can also scribble with your ballpoint pen and get thicker lines by shading in. But when we're doing it like this, we're doing it in that kind of engraving like style. We know we kind of have a fairly uniform line width we're working on. We also know that we have to think about that traveling. So then we start to think about how close together details are. In the case of the piece you just looked at, that's really not the case, because this piece, the lines are even. This is really delineating the edges of shapes. That's really all this sort of border work is going to do. However, we look at some of these other designs. In fact, even if I just look at this one, this is Monsanto Baseball. This is a design where I did Monty the Lion, which there are several versions with different balls and monograms and things under his arm. But Monty is done in a very similar type of way. In fact, let me go ahead and pull out that purple. You'll see, once again, the purple for Monsanto's Monty the Lion is done in that carved way where we have our satin stitches carved for the tail. We have different curvatures of fill for the body. We have a radial kind of fill with a long minimum stitch for the mane, and it has a randomness to it that gives it some texture, and that's all interesting and wonderful and good. But the final design, as we can see, is really characterized by some of this shading work. And the thing to look at in the shading work isn't just stitch type. And in fact, let's hide everything except for that line work. So let's go ahead and hide everything else. So we can't see that anymore. Monty still carries the same sort of look in this line work. The thing to understand is we have areas that are darker, even though this is essentially a loose zigzag or a satin that's doing it. What makes the difference between darker and lighter areas in the outside of the mane? It's how far apart these lines are. They are still stitched in tours. We are still working with largely double stitches for most of that. So let's get into his face. We can see some of these details are, literally just the whiskers. Those are individual. Those are not shaded. But as we get through here, we have that really dark area. But depending on how close together these doubled lines are in the rest of the piece, that shows us we get more or less gap. The more airspace we have, the lighter the area, the less airspace we have, the darker. So if we're looking at this piece especially, we can see there's a little bit lighter area over here, but it's darker in certain patches where those lines are closer together. Because though they are, like I said, doubled lines of stitching, we have some areas where those doubled lines are close, some where they aren't. And what we essentially get is densities, right? So even though we're drawing them with our straight stitch tool, what we can say is, all right, in a given area, and if I want to measure it, and you can kind of see it below my head here when I have measurements with my ruler tool, I'm hitting the M tool and I'm clicking and dragging. If we understand this to be 4 lines of stitching in here, which it is, we've doubled those lines together, and we say, all right, if I go over essentially 3 of those lines, it's about 0.4 mils. There's going to be area in here that is about as dark as a fill. It's almost going to be as dark as filled stitching. Whereas over here, we think about those kind of 4 lines or 3 lines, and we have 1 millimeter. It'll be a little more than half, a little less rather than half density in that area. And if we go back from here, and I'll go ahead and zip this out, and we'll go look at the picture of Monty if we can get that up. And I don't know if I've got a good picture of Monty here. I may actually have oversold that. I actually don't have a good picture of Monty today. Thought I had an actual pic of that. I do not. But let's just go ahead and zoom out, and we'll kind of look at it with our 3D preview, and that's still going to give us kind of an idea of this. If we look at this with our preview turned on, we can certainly see that some of those areas are similar to a filled area. Pardon me, I've got a little issue here. There we go. Every once in a while, StreamYard slows up on me. We can see that this area is almost as dark as a fill, whereas these areas are not that dark whatsoever when we turn on that preview. Easier to see in the preview than in the regular thickness. These areas where it's close together are almost as dark as a filled area, whereas these are nice and open and loose. And that's the thing. You aren't going to see all of it because when we draw a line exactly on top of itself, even in 3D preview, it's not going to show double thicknesses, but it will be thicker than that in the actual piece. Unfortunately, I thought I had a picture queued up for that guy, but I did not. I apologize. But yeah, same kind of thing going on there. It is worth understanding that that's happening. And in fact, let me show you that cornucopia. I believe I do have a picture of this guy. And what you're going to see is it looks considerably denser than this because the lines are going to be thicker than this than you see in the preview. It looks fairly light, fairly open. The actual piece is going to be darker. So I'll go ahead and try and bring that up for you guys as well. Hopefully I've got my my actual picture. There it is. Let's go ahead and bring up the image. This is the actual stitch out for the cornucopia. And what you can see is that in the cornucopia itself, it's actually fairly dark. And what we can also see is just the same way you might expect from any kind of density. These lines follow this curvature, and the inside is denser than the outside. We have more space on the outside than we have on the inside. So we get this darker area up here. Number one, because we have a small shaded area up here that's kind of showing the fluting of this basket-like woven cornucopia. But we also have more spacing on this outer edge than we have on the inner edge. And it makes have a nice darker area in here. And the density, however, you'll see the thickness of the lines themselves. If we go back to the original piece, it does look a little lighter in software by far than you see it in the actual piece. So like I said, it really is, you have to be mindful of those things as yourself. You have to be mindful of the passes and the way that you kind of attack those things. But ultimately, it doesn't have to be fully planned out. It's just more about keeping track of those individual branches as you go. But when we are thinking about trying to achieve value, and I think it's worthwhile to look at any of these other pieces that are more of that nature. Even the pediatrics pieces like that, but I think better than all of these is probably looking at detail on the Dion's piece here. We have also, the other thing to notice, we have some of these lines, and I'll zoom in really tight to see these. There are some of the lines that are spaced out further. These are only single thickness lines, and then you can see the double thickness lines next to them. And we can see through this is almost kind of a gradation. We have this very dark area here, and these were drawn in manually. This is not a fill stitch. So these are manually drawn. You can see the curvature changing through each line, but they're almost as dark as a fill. They almost have full coverage. Honestly, I should have been maybe a little more careful. Certainly up in the nose, I went a little too hard on how many lines I included, and I did not leave it enough room to breathe. So it really turned into kind of a satin stitch where it really should have had a little more openness throughout. But if we look at this kind of gradient from the inside of this collar out to the exit of the collar, out of this outside tip of the collar and the area underneath it, under his apron strap, what you can see is where we are closer together, obviously it is approaching full density. Where we get further out, we have open space. It's the same as your fills. It's the same as your satins. It's the same as an accordion fill, but we're drawing this manually, which gives us the other kind of thing we can get for line work as far as getting kind of some character out of line work, which is the motion that's in the line work, which is the direction of lines and the position of lines and the angle at which they interact with each other. Because that piece is not done in a very mechanical way like a fill, we have a little bit more texture and a little bit more interest in it than you would have if you had said, okay, I need a gradient kind of area here, so I'm going to go ahead and draw this out. Now, admittedly, the original piece of art that I was working from was an engraving style, woodcut style piece of work. So I had lines that the original artist had used to shade that area, and it gave me guidance as to the direction of the lines in the piece. However, what you can see in this that makes it a little bit different, as an embroiderer, there are times where you have to decide that I'm going to omit certain lines to let the area be open enough. And that's where we're talking about things like detail density. People talk about density as if it is only something that's a setting for your satins or your fill stitches, but detail density is when we are drawing our own details. We have to be mindful of the measurements that we're working on, the scale we're working on, because as we start to draw things really close together, we can create essentially fill stitches. And if that's not what you're trying to do, if that's not your intention, you can be pretty unhappy with your results because you've made lines that are so close together that they're essentially fills, and they're kind of continually getting too dark, too dense. And when we have very small details, super common in the eyes, in these super detailed areas in these pieces, we can end up with things like knotting and thread breaks and areas that just look too dense. They're fully, completely covered and filled in because we're trying to include too much detail in small areas. So we do have to think about that as part of the concept of those measurements. Like I said, this is maybe not the most creative thing to think about, but it really is. Controlling this is how we get to a point where we can understand more about what we're doing, where you can kind of really take some control over that. And I think sometimes that's something that people don't think about when they're doing straight stitch work or any sort of manual stitch work. They start to draw lines, they zoom in at an incredible like 4,000, 6,000% scale and start to draw every line that is in an original piece of art. They're just tracing that line work. Or if they're working from a photograph, maybe they're trying to just intimate a bunch of shading and they put too much of it close together, and you end up with something that looks like a fill or a satin stitch, which may or may not be what you are trying to achieve. I mean, that is kind of the thing. If you don't mean for that to happen, then you can have some issues with that you may not have thought of in the first place. Like I said, it's not it's not something that's necessarily always a problem, but it's something that I often see people frustrated with. It looks too dark. It doesn't look like I expected to look. It's not what I was hoping for. And often that problem is just that we are getting too kind of tied up on this concept of what that's going to look like, how many lines are in this piece. We're trying to reproduce everything that is there. And when we do that, reproduction of everything that's there, invariably we end up with something that is not exactly what we had hoped for, because we're just overly packing in detail and we forget scale. We forget we're working on embroidery. And that is always kind of it is just invariably going to cause us pain if we forget that we're working on embroidery, if we forget that what we're actually doing is something that's going to have that physicality to the thread. So really depends. And yeah, Scott says this, yeah, using positive and negative space, absolutely. You got to think about the spaces where stitches aren't. Only use the stitches that need to be there. And frankly, when we're talking about things like that engraving, I'll just bring up the image again. Worthwhile just to look at it as a picture. We don't necessarily have to go into the digitizing. What we can see is just looking at this image, zooming in on detail, you can see where I've got those same tours. I'm touring out and I'm doing those doubled lines, but we can also see that in some of these areas, they're very close together. And if you aren't being very careful with it, it's super simple as you're zoomed in incredibly tight and you're working on a piece to just absolutely overdo our detail in that piece. It's not at all strange to see somebody doing that, because it's easy for us to zoom in very tight and be working on a piece and go too deep. In fact, I'll bring in another piece you guys may have seen before. It's another free design that's over at the Brilliance blog, if you want to look at the project blog. And this is my Lady Liberty design, very similar piece. I'll just go ahead and bring that back in. I had my software on the other screen for a second. But this is another one where we've done this manual work, and some of it is in single stitch. So instead of being doubled stitches, I have areas where I have some single stitch work as well. But what we can see when we're working in these eyes is that it's just much less than you think it's going to be. A lot of that detail has to be removed. We cannot have too many lines and get too close together. If we do that, we're just going to see that invariably we have larger issues with getting that excess density. But we can see certainly, like down here in the neck, we have fairly light lines. They're fairly far apart. Over here in the nose where we have a sharper shadow, they're closer together. And even in the preview, you can see how that's going to be lighter and darker. It's really about that value. But other areas where we want that value to be fairly universal, we're not trying to be, going thick and thin. We're trying to have that be universal. Whereas over here, we see in the sleeve, we've got specifically darker areas with literally more lines per inch. It is just the same as density. So let me go ahead and pull that down. I believe I've got a image of that one too we can look at, and I'll just kind of show you how that actually turns out. And it gives us just more of a concept of how those features are pulled together. And let's go ahead and bring this one out. This one, a little more careful. In fact, this is the second version of this piece that I did. I had reconstructed it from a piece I did earlier on in my career. And when I did this piece, I removed some of that excess. And in fact, what you're going to see is because I used a single stitch detail in here, we have some openness in the nose that I really should have had. It needs to have some texture. It needs to have some openness. I don't want a solid satin stitch. And in this case, I've used a single stitch and done very much like you do with your satin stitches. I went to an area where I could travel out and come back and not connect it to the rest of that line so that I could have a lighter, thinner line. So the thing we have to think about is we're actually playing with both of those concepts that we talked about earlier. We're playing with passes for the thickness of the line, and then we're playing with detail density, how close together the lines are that I draw, right? So the lines that I draw, how close they are together, determines how tight, how dense that area is. But if those lines are passed over twice, obviously I'm going to have double the density than if they're passed over once. So we have to make sure we think about both those things. And it is also a way to mix in finer detail into a piece like this piece where most of those lines are doubled. You can see they're mostly of that double thickness. The other lines that are in the piece are lighter. The area around the nose is lighter, and we have some lighter, finer details. How is that achieved? Through a single pass that looks much more like a fill stitch. And you can see it in the design itself that this area, instead of having the thicker doubled lines, has this travel area that is a single line. And how I've achieved that is the nose also has a thinner line. It only has a single pass, but you don't really see it because the connecting stitches between this kind of fill line run really close to the nose. So I'm playing with the same sort of extra thickness I got almost incidentally that we saw in that brooch piece where the circles on the back were very close to the lines defining that spine on both edges. Those lines being close to the circles made it look denser, made it look darker in the lines, even though I didn't have extra passes. Same thing here. I only have one pass along the side of the nose, as you can see here, but as I'm doing this shading next to it, the connecting lines between these shading lines, I've put them very close to that nose line. So the nose still looks like it has a nice dark outline, but this detail line on the outside edge is lighter. It's just a trick of how close lines are together and how they are placed. It can make things look thicker or denser. Also, you see these lines again. We don't have a ton of little lines trying to capture the curvature of the eye. You literally on each side have just those two lines. What I'm going to make clear again, we have 2 stitches for the curvature of each iris. But if we zoom in nice and tight, you can see that in that zoomed in area, we can see an offset between the lines where we have one line here, one line here. The stitch points are slightly offset. That slight offset is going to make it look more rounded. And so in the final piece, when we do actually have that piece sewn out at size, we get a look that is fairly round to the irises of the eyes. And you can see how there's that lighter shading next to the nose. So we have rounded irises from that offset, and we have that lighter shading next to the nose. And I'm going to go ahead and try and pull up one more thing, and we'll make this maybe the last thing. One of those reasons I talked about, why do I offset those lines and how does that look? What's the difference? And we'll see if I can pull that up. I think it's worthwhile to kind of show that. Why do I do that? What's the point of doing that sort of work? And it really is about understanding that offset and knowing that we're working with stitches. Because frequently what we do is we get kind of lost in this concept of, copying those lines and making sure they make sense and all that other stuff. We get lost in that sometimes. And when we do that, we are slavish to it. We're copying those lines. We're copying vector. We're reusing lines that we've drawn, and we're looking at how curved the line is. But we sometimes forget until we generate stitches on top of those lines, especially for someone coming from a design background where we've done a lot of that sort of stuff. We can have this concept of line work that doesn't really help us. We think that our drawn line is a curvature, but we're going to plot straight stitches along that line. It's going to be a polygon. Any circle you make in embroidery is really just a polygon made of a small or a number of small sides around it. There's no way, because a line of stitching, every stitch is a straight line from one point to a point because it's a thread under tension. Cannot be anything but a straight line. To get that curvature, though, we can play games with the concept of how these things offset. And so I'm just going to go ahead and show you. It's often like string art. This is what we're talking about, right? If I draw a curve, and I mean just a perfect little curve from this point over here on the left to this point on the right, and so it's got one point that's passing through in my software, but then I go ahead and tell the software, yep, I want a double run. What's it going to do? It's going to drop exactly the same stitch points on both tours. 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 3 to 4. We go through that place, and as we return back, the same penetration points along the line are going to be created almost invariably. Doesn't maybe always do exactly the same, but they're going to be very close because we have a standard length of that stitch. However, if I run a second set of offset runs, and especially if I'm doing this manually, which we can do either with a straight stitch or a manual stitch, is one last topic I'll go ahead and cover. We can offset the penetration points, and you can just see it, even just looking at this sample, as we run back from the end with that second run. So we have the first run in red, the second run in blue. As we run back across that same curvature, we can see that we only have these exposed little mini segments and these little points instead of these large facets. And that looks more round to the eye. It rounds out that line. So I draw the lines twice to offset the stitch penetration points. And at certain sizes, when I start to get small enough, so let's go back to our Lady Liberty face. When I get small enough, I'm drawing these stitches one at a time manually. I am very likely at this point, when I am down to these sub-millimeter measurements, when you can see these tiny boxes that are in here in gray, those are millimeter boxes. When I have millimeter, like 1.2, 1 millimeter, and sometimes sub-millimeter measurements, especially some of these offsets, I want to control those stitch points individually. I'm going to drop those one by one. Now, this doesn't always mean, and this is the last topic I'm going to cover as I finish up here, this doesn't always mean using the manual stitch tool. We're sitting here in Stitch Artist 3 right now. If I were to grab the manual stitch tool, this is what I'd be using. I would be using my same points, but I would have my manual stitch tool, and I'm dropping stitches individually, right? That is one way to drop individual stitches. That's how they work, right? So we're looking at individual stitches. The other thing we can do, instead of using a manual stitch tool, when we are under the length of our stitch length, of our overall stitch length, we can use a straight stitch tool, a manual, instead of the manual stitch tool, we can use our run stitch tool. And what you're going to notice is two things. Most software, when we drop a hard corner point like this, is already going to give us a stitch penetration point. And if we are under the length of the stitches that's set, so let's say I've got like it says here, a 2.6 millimeter stitch, but at no point do I reach 2 millimeters. What you're going to notice is even though this is now a run stitch instead of a manual stitch, every penetration point I have is going to be an individual stitch anyway. So why would you use the run stitch tool versus this other tool? So let's say we wanted to use a manual stitch, but we're running a run stitch. The cool thing is we can then mix between fine detail and larger curves and not worry quite so much about the details being off. So what we can do is go from running something where we do intend to have curves, right? We have a curved stitch on purpose and we're okay with it plotting those stitches. And then we have a smaller detail and we want to do smaller detailed elements off of that piece. We can still do that and we can end up where at the end we get a similar outcome, but we're okay with having that longer span break up automatically and not having to draw every single stitch. And we can do that by using that run stitch tool. It means that we still get the breakup of the stitches along this edge the way we might want them for a longer span like we have in the curvature here. But let's say if we really wanted to control our offset and make this little element look a little more curved and start really controlling those very small stitches, we still can, and we don't have to replace this other point. It still can have those stitches. And if we decide that 2.6 is too long on the longer straights, we can then go to 2 or go down even further and get those smaller stitches. If we want them here, we can adjust that. Or that if we are upscaling something, let's say we don't have a ton of manual work like this, we do have a small stuff in it. As we upscale, we don't end up with super long stitches like we have here. Whereas if I had drawn those individually, we might not be able to reuse that if we need to do a slightly larger size where we end up that those individual stitches start looking too long. In this case, I might still have that problem down here because I transitioned into a smaller element that I started doing detail work on. But if it was just a curve, let's say we have a much simpler piece, you might want to use that anyway, even if you are at some points deciding to do this kind of detailed work, so that when you rescale, you don't have to try and replace every stitch if you want to maintain a smaller stitch length along a line. So that's the kind of reason why you might use those two tools. So the other thing to think about with this is, despite the fact that I'm saying manual stitch or doing manual control in things like this trying to handle each of these points individually, we don't have to use the manual stitch type. We can use the straight stitch type or the running stitch type, depending on your software, and still do those small stitches by plotting them manually under the length, using hard points, using corner points under the length of the stitches that we would usually place. So it's just a different way to handle it. Both of those tools will make a decent line that you can control. We're still kind of doing the same thing. The main mental work is still about passes. It's still about tours. It's still about pathing. All right, folks. So I went the whole time anyway. What I'll say is, hopefully that was useful to you guys. I know not as many of you were probably in to just hear that much detail about fine line work. For the people who specifically asked for it, I'll be emailing you guys back to answer any other specific questions. However, we had several of you over the last while, 3 people who were just absolutely laser focused on just this, that I think will have gotten quite a lot out of it. I remember those 3, but we had many people who have asked me about certain pieces that are kind of in this realm, very much like Scott talking about detail work and shading. We will go back into this at other times because this is all part of that same essential group. Why do I call this essentials? Why do I say this is kind of one of those the essentials lists? We've had other episodes that I called the essentials because this is something where you can build with this into anything. When we can control the individual stitch and we understand what we have in a straight stitch, right? A straight or a running stitch has very few things we can control, right? It has the length of the stitch. It has the regularity of that stitch. If you have a randomness setting in your software for straight stitches, some do, some don't. If you are working with that stitch, the rest of it then starts to be about how we draw And so at first, we've got length and regularity. That's just about all we have. Then we can talk about things that are not necessarily just software based, the way we start and end these pieces, how many times we go over them, and then detail density, how close together the lines that we draw are, and how much that covers what's behind, therefore making value, how dark an area is compared to how close together the lines are in it. These are the things we can control about these stitches. Other than that, the other things we can control that are kind of software related are the things like using the tools in the way that I just showed you, where we can use hard points to force a needle drop, and that we can use stitch lengths and offsetting our entry points in order to do things that round out lines. Then it's about drawing. And it's about creative decisions when we're looking at the art. And then it becomes about how we digitize, how we draw. That's why it can get technical. At the same time, what I do want you to understand is once you have this locked in, you know where you're headed with it. It doesn't have to be that we're plotting our way through this entire world of a design before we ever touch the stitches. Very obviously, I showed you a couple where even I got a little surprised and went, wow, you know what? I'm looking at this again, and I probably would pat this differently these days. Or if I was doing it ideally and I had to come back and make a million of these pieces, I might change a piece of the way I drew it for efficiency or for some other reason. The thing is, that design still ran and looked good and was production ready and didn't have problems and didn't get returned. I've got a couple of pieces in there where I showed you where I've got changes that were made in a later version, but all of those pieces ran, were sold, looked good. I showed you stitch outs for most of them. You don't have to be perfect on your pathing. You don't have to be perfect on your passes even for a piece to be successful. But when we start to think of those rules ahead of time, it becomes these guiding principles so that when we are going to draw our piece, we can break things down into bite-sized pieces. When you're drawing the tree, we're not pathing through the whole tree. As we go to each branch, we're taking a branch as it comes and coming back to our center point and continuing on one tour at a time. All right, folks. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and let that be the end of the show for today. Here's hoping you got something out of it. If you have topics you want to cover, if you have people you want to see, by all means, send me messages. I am going to keep on returning to the well of not only things people have said in the surveys that I've put out, but people have asked me and the questions I get throughout each week. But if you have something else that's specific, leave a comment. I can't always get to everything, or it doesn't always make sense. But when I see enough people who are interested where I think it's going to be useful or evergreen for folks who are trying to learn this stuff, I will cover it. So by all means, reach out, use the forms at ericcampbell.com to reach out, or leave a comment here or on any of the places you are, and I will try and get to that. Lots of people talking about different topics, and I want to cover what you need. With that, folks, I really can't recommend doing some of this plain black work enough as a practice. Grab yourself a design. There's lots of lovely old illustrations, like I showed you that dogwood flower earlier. Old botanical illustrations are great. There's tons of stuff out there in the full public domain from old school books before the era of photographs, where a lot of that stuff was common, these plates of decoration. Pick a piece up and try it. It's very meditative. It can be a great way to relax while you digitize, because it gets to be kind of zen as you just follow and come back to the points as you draw. It's worth some time to try, and getting it done, sewing it out, looking at the values of the lines, how dark things get, how they look, and how the stitches are affected by your choices is just the best way to learn. Let's get out there, stitch something, and I can't wait to see you guys again next week.